This podcast is a member of the Place to Be Nation family. Visit us at placetobenation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.
Welcome to the Marvel Age Masterclass podcast with host Ben Morse. Episode 10, 1967 Part 2 with Tim Capel.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Marvel Age Masterclass, your favorite podcast here on Place to Be Nation Pop, hosted by me, Ben Morse. I am a professor at UNLV, I am a maven of social media, and I am formerly the editorial director of digital media at Marvel Comics, bringing to you a year-by-year look back at the history of the House of Ideas, supplementing the mothership Marvel Age podcast, which can also be found right here on Place to Be Nation. Joining me tonight, one of the Sarcastic Four. Welcome back, Tim Capel.
Professor Morse.
Yes.
After
Mr. Capel.
Yeah. You know, after our last session, I have visions of Jake Hansen dancing through my head.
I was listening back to the episode today, and I'm just... because I was listening. Because it took me about a week and a half to listen to the Place to Be podcast 500th episode. So I was a little delayed. By the way, congratulations to Scott and Justin on reaching 500.
Absolutely.
That's quite a milestone. But yeah, I was listening back to our part one today to get me psyched up for tonight, and I was right in the heart of our Melrose Place chat. And I will take you to task on that as far as making that happen on Talking Pop.
I got you.
At some point in the future.
Yep, I got you. We're gonna. I don't know when. I don't even know where necessarily, but
I don't know how.
I want it as bad as you do.
Beautiful. I already started thinking about some big topics. I already started thinking about my F, Marry, Kill list. Ready to go. Yeah. And Melrose Place is a show where you really could F, Marry, Kill.
And they often did.
There's a real danger of all of them.
Unreal.
So that's not what we're talking about tonight, unfortunately. But we are talking about something else fun, and that is the latter half of 1967 in Marvel Comics. You guys, of course, covered some great books on the main Marvel Age podcast, and now we're going to take kind of another look at them today, Tim. I tried to pay special attention to what you said on the episode.
Okay.
I tuned everyone else out, so I would think of good things to talk about with you.
I like that.
Yeah, so it was all about you.
You may have better recollection of what I said than I did. So.
Oh well, let's see what we can do in terms of jogging your memory.
Yeah.
So I'm actually going to do something different than what you guys did, and I'm going to start with the biggest and best title of the year, rather than trudge through the lesser titles and then run out of time. I want to get straight to Amazing Spider-Man.
Okay.
Which, much like we talked about Fantastic Four on our last episode, and we talked about the epic Doctor Doom Silver Surfer confrontation, there's an equally classic Spider-Man story that we need to get to here. And we'll get to it in a sec, but before we do that, I want to cover quickly the one-shot battle against Kraven the Hunter, because I got some stuff to say.
I thought you might, yeah.
This battle. Yeah, I got a few things to say. Well, number one, in the way of education, I am a professor after all. You guys were wondering why this issue was on the list, because it seemed kind of non-essential to the ongoing plot of Spider-Man. I can only speculate, but I suspect that perhaps a reason it could have been included was this is actually a pretty famous issue in the context of modern comics. And the reason for that is, I don't know if you read Joe Kelly's Deadpool series, Tim.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
You know where I'm going with that? So this was indeed the famous Amazing Spider-Man issue that was spoofed in Deadpool number 11.
Okay.
If anyone hasn't read it, it is literally one of my favorite single issues of all time. The premise is that Deadpool and Blind Al go back in time, and Deadpool, Wade Wilson, using an image inducer, takes the place of Peter Parker.
Yes.
Well, Blind Al takes the place of May Parker, and they reenact this issue. Battle with Kraven the Hunter, interactions with Mary Jane and Gwen, crazy stuff with Harry and Norman Osborn, all of it revisited to maximum humor by the team of Joe Kelly and Pete Woods in Deadpool number 11. Just amazing. I'm not even going to spoil any of the gags. I believe it's on Marvel Unlimited, the Webby Award-winning Marvel Unlimited. Everyone should check that out. Whether you're a Deadpool fan or not, it's just hysterical.
That makes complete sense to me because I know that there is quite a bit of Deadpool on this list looking ahead to the 90s. And I'm actually cheating a bit here to see if that particular issue is going to be covered. And let's see, we've got Deadpool issues 1 through 7 coming up in 97. And you said that was, yep, okay. Issue 11 is, yeah, we're doing Deadpool issues 1 through 11 just in 1997. So
our friend who created this list, clearly a big Deadpool fan.
Quite so. Yep,
Yeah.
That explains it then. Okay.
Well, and not only that, I'm not even going to stop there, Tim. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and I rarely am, that this is also the basis for an issue of Spider-Man Blue by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. They also revisit this story.
I kind of picked that up too because I reread Spider-Man Blue just a couple of years back, and it sort of, as they say, dances between the raindrops of continuity with that story. And it is a retrospective in the way that it's told. It's Peter reminiscing and, thinking back on his memories of Gwen, and I think actually listening to some recordings as well. And yeah, I mean, it's weaving in and out of this time period, and probably this story would have been in there. So there's a case to be made for that too, for sure.
So for whatever reason, this story just resonated with Jeff Loeb and Joe Kelly. I think part of it is just because it's such a slice of life issue in the life of Peter Parker. It's kind of a nice snapshot of him, his supporting cast. You get a decent Spider-Man fight. It's not a remarkable by any means issue, but it's just a perfect example of what Lee and Romita were doing at this time. It kind of represents the larger whole of their run, and I think for that reason it's it's as good a selection as any. But I think we've, by doing a little detective work, definitely tracked down the reason. I think it definitely has more to do with that Deadpool issue than anything else.
Yeah, well done. So be looking forward to coverage of that in the next half century or so.
Yeah, and 15 years from now we will get to that issue of Deadpool. But yeah, I will issue myself a no prize for figuring that out. Awesome. And the other thing I want to touch on before we move on to the big story is, of course, Nick Duke's Kraven dissing of Kraven. Just completely unnecessary, out of nowhere. Hated Kraven the Hunter. Had the gall to suggest that the Ultimate Universe version of Kraven was superior. As listeners of this podcast know, Kraven is probably, outside of, I don't put him, I put Green Goblin and Doc Ock in like a special tier of Spider-Man villains where it's kind of understood that they're the best, and maybe even Venom slides in there as well. But to me, of the rest of the Spider-Man villains, I always loved Kraven. I think he absolutely looks ridiculous. I will cop to that. But I think he is a genuine threat despite looking ridiculous, and I just like the gimmickry of him. See, I'm not even leaning on saying, oh well, Nick needs to read Kraven's Last Hunt. Yes, Kraven's Last Hunt is phenomenal, but I like the early Kraven stories when he's hunting Spider-Man. It's the greatest game. It just seemed different to me, and I apologize for the sirens in the background. Of course,
quite all right.
This is Las Vegas. It's a city that truly never sleeps.
Yes.
But I just like that Kraven was different. He wasn't another animal-themed villain. He wasn't an old man. He was just this weird jungle hunter who came after Spider-Man because he had conquered all the other challenges in his life, and he was determined to conquer this one as well. He gets some really good stories as you get into the 80s, but I was a fan of Kraven from the start, and I know that's a somewhat controversial opinion because he's got like lion eyes on his nipples, but
which fire optic blasts,
but I wouldn't change my opinion for the world.
All right. Well, I knew you would have some feelings on Kraven. I'm glad we got them on the record. And I wondered if that stemmed from just being a big fan of like Kraven's Last Hunt. So I'm glad to know that no, you don't have to go that deep into, you know, the actual classics, so to speak. It's that argument, I think, between best versus personal favorite. You know, we all kind of have our personal favorites, even if we acknowledge this is not, you know, in the upper echelon of, I mean, it's all subjective, of course, but as you said, Green Goblin, Doc Ock, Venom, arguably. Even if those aren't your favorites, it's hard to say they aren't these top 3 villains. So once you get below that, it's kind of all up for argument.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, look, Spider-Man has a deep bench when it comes to villains. You just got to look at some of the ones who have made it to the big screen. I think is a good example of that. Like, there's nothing wrong with your Vultures, your Mysterios, your Lizards, but I do think your Electros. But I do think, there's a certain class of villain that is Green Goblin, Doc Ock, Venom, maybe even Carnage for a second. I think he got overexposed, but he could have been along those lines. Mm-hmm. But there's a clear second tier, and I'm not arguing that Kraven cracks into that elite group, but certainly personal favorite. That was how I would describe my relationship with Kraven the Hunter. So moving on to more Spider-Man, the big Spider-Man arc of 1967 is, of course, the iconic Spider-Man No More. We get that amazing Romita cover with Spider-Man's silhouette walking off into the distance, Peter giving up the costume, tossing it in the trash, deciding not to be Spider-Man anymore. This is actually the basis of great arc in Spider-Man 2, the movie, where he also gives up being Spider-Man. Mm-hmm. And they actually recreate the shot in the movie, which is phenomenal. Yeah. But the thing that's interesting here is it's in the wake of, you know, just having a tough time with his love life, with his family life, and all the things against him. Peter Parker just decides, you know what, being Spider-Man is too much. It's one step too far. I don't need this responsibility. And the Kingpin makes his debut. We'll talk about him in a sec. Kind of comes in and makes a big play for the city. And ultimately, Peter Parker relearns the lesson that with great power comes great responsibility. What I want to talk about, Tim, is just the idea that this is another thing to me that separated Spider-Man from so many other heroes of the time. Mm-hmm. And that was that as much as he was conflicted and as much as he was relatable, you almost wanted Peter Parker to give up being Spider-Man.
Yes.
Because you genuinely come to like him and see how hard it is for him to be Spider-Man. And I think that happens in a way that, say, with Superman and Clark Kent, there was always an element of, oh, if he could only stop being Superman, he could, you know, marry Lois and be happy or whatever. But it wasn't like this great albatross that was weighing him down.
Right.
Whereas with Spidey, it feels like sometimes he really is ruining Peter's life. And because we have such a kinship with Peter, we feel the weight that being Spider-Man puts on.
And Stan puts such a great argument in favor of that through the crafting of this story. Just the way that he throws so many obstacles in Peter's path that it kind of convinces you and wins you over, even if you're not, you know, as a kid predisposed to thinking, gosh, this guy should really stop being Spider-Man. It's such a burden, and I care for him so much as a person. I don't want him to keep doing this to himself.
Yeah.
He just makes such a compelling argument why it's just not good for him. And Superman is such the flip side of that. When you make the comparison, you can almost say, well, why doesn't he just stop being Clark Kent? He could get so much more done if he was just Superman full time. And understandably that's not going to happen, and wouldn't make for better stories, and isn't kind of the natural argument that you want to see made. But that's like the easier case than for Peter not being Spider-Man. So that is a great way to just highlight the differences between these characters. And I mean, not that they're the same in terms of power levels, but as far as being icons and nationally recognized characters and flag bearers for their respective companies, that right there kind of sums it up. It's not so much just that relatability factor, but just you like this guy, you root for him, and you just want him to have a good day for a change.
Not even a good life, just to literally give him a good day.
Throw him a bone.
Yeah. It's kind of the brilliance of Stan Lee. This is where I think he really shines, in that part of you wants to be Spider-Man. Like, you're like, oh, that would be cool to have those powers, to be swinging around the city, to be quipping, to, be cracking wise and having fun. But then on the other hand, like, you understand what a burden being Spider-Man is. All the tragedy that comes with it, all the angst that comes with it. So it was really impressive on Stan's part that he was able to write so nuanced a character and so nuanced a double identity. So that idea of, yes, Spider-Man in some ways is wish fulfillment. Of course, we all want to be superheroes and put on a costume and save the world. But on the other hand, we can sympathize with Peter Parker, who just wants to be a normal teenager and just wants to, take the girl he likes out for a date and have dinner with his aunt and not worry about what the Sandman's doing. Mm-hmm. And the other end of it too is, I think the other weight of it is the secret, is having to keep this a secret from all his loved ones and all the people around him. I always thought that Stan and his collaborators did a great job of that in the early Spider-Man comics, of showing being Spider-Man might be cool, but it really sucks to have to keep this secret from everyone around you, and really, really impress the weight of the secret identity, maybe better than any other superhero.
It's something that he views as a responsibility that competes with all of his other very legitimate and very visible responsibilities that, gets touched on in the issue. But he can't tell everyone else in his life, well, this is why, Aunt May, I'm sorry I wasn't here for you when you got sick for the 100,000th time, whatever. This is why, Professor Warren, I'm failing science class. This is why I can't come to your party, Gwen. This is why I can't study, Harry. He can't tell anyone that he has this huge albatross, basically, because of the fact that he has to keep this secret, and as you said, is a burden, but a responsibility that he takes to heart at the same time. So I love that aspect just as much as you.
Yeah, and the story told here, the eventual return, the eventual comeback to fight the Kingpin, is done in such a way that I think we have mixed emotions about it. On the one hand, we're rooting for him because, yes, Spider-Man's back. He's going to beat the bad guy. He's going to do what's right. He's going to win the day for all the innocent people. But at the same time, there is that twinge of regret and that twinge of pity on Peter Parker because he cannot escape this curse. And part of the curse is that he made a mistake years ago, lost his uncle, and it's almost like because he made that mistake, he's doomed to this life. It is somewhat tragic, even as much as it's great and heroic and uplifting and all that. There is this sense of sorrow to this poor kid screwed up one time, and he's never going to be able to outrun his guilt.
Yeah, it's just eating him alive.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just a great story. It's one of the best stories probably of the era, and really solidifies what makes Marvel Comics special, just in terms of having these three-dimensional layered characters who you get really invested in. It was some of Stan's best work. It was some of Romita's best work.
Yeah.
Romita excelled at not only depicting superhero action, but just the regular stuff with Peter and the supporting cast. He was great at that. He was great at capturing emotion. And when Peter looked anguished, God, he looked so anguished. He looked so just beat down upon. Like, it was really great stuff. So this is an A-list creative team doing A-list work.
Yep, and it's post Steve Ditko's Spider-Man, and the book has necessarily changed in Ditko's absence. And there's a real risk of, hey, has the heart gone out of this thing now without one of its principal creators? And this issue, number 50, I think lays to rest any notions of that. While it is different, it is still full of heart.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely a lot of heart baked in. And the other big aspect of this arc of Spider-Man, of course, as we've touched upon a couple times, is the introduction of Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin of crime. And great villain, classic villain, seminal villain. Really just in terms of what they create, we were talking about, how Kraven stands out, and the different types of Spider-Man villains. Kingpin was a little bit different in the sense that he was the ultimate version, and I'm not saying ultimate cannily here, but he was the ultimate version of a crime boss, which was always a recurring thing in Spider-Man. Green Goblin wanted to rule the underworld. Crime Master tried to rule the underworld. Doc Ock tried to rule the underworld. And there were all these guys who kind of came in as transitional mob boss type characters. But Wilson Fisk was really the end-all be-all. This is the guy who, all right, we now have a legitimate, intimidating, imposing figure with a great Romita design. Just super memorable. You don't forget what the Kingpin looks like ever. And he can step in and be this mafia underworld figure who is extremely compelling. And I think, I don't know this for a fact, but I would wager, much in the same way that when they came up with Doctor Doom, Lee and Kirby knew that he would always be the top Fantastic Four villain, but also could serve as a greater Marvel Universe villain. I think Lee and Romita always imagined greater things for the Kingpin. It's ironic that it would not be either one of them who would ultimately pair Kingpin with his most famous adversary years and years later.
Yes. Yeah, no doubt. I enjoyed this introduction to the Kingpin quite a lot. What struck me
was, well, of course you've seen
the 90s Spider-Man cartoon.
Oh, the 90s Spider-Man cartoon?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of course. Loved it.
So I haven't seen an episode of that cartoon in years.
Yeah,
but
me either.
I am reminded by these really two issues, 51 and 52, like how much that series borrowed from this particular era of Spider-Man.
Oh, absolutely,
comics.
100%.
Like I wouldn't have known that watching the show as a kid. Like I wouldn't have seen a lot of John Romita Sr. art at the time. But now I'm realizing just kind of how indelible certain aspects of that animated series are in my mind, and how much that this just story in particular reminded me of any random episode of that show.
Yeah, well, I think there's something too visually. The idea that if you're doing just any cartoon for kids, something that is kind of like bright and colorful and smooth, has the appeal. Ditko's Spider-Man's going to be a little bit of a tougher adaptation for a Saturday morning kids cartoon, but Romita, it was perfect. Like it looks like a kids cartoon come to life. Just the big set pieces, the colorful villains, the design of the way people look. Just like, yeah, I mean, and they did adapt a lot of stories. And I don't know what we have ahead on the reading list as far as Amazing Spider-Man, but there are quite a few Lee Romita stories that would get adapted directly to the animated series. So this is not the last you would see of that phenomenon.
Yep, and that's something I'm looking forward to as we read along too. I even hear in my head when certain characters, especially villains, appear, the little fanfare that the series would do, and I don't even know why, because I'm not like that when it comes to the X-Men animated series.
Right.
Beyond just the iconic classic theme opening,
right?
I don't remember much from just the actual score of that show. But
I remember little musical stings from the X-Men, the animated series, and I won't think of it until a character shows up. Like when Cable shows up, I remember Cable's musical introduction. Same with Bishop. But
See, now I'm hearing him.
Yeah, right. The Spider-Man cartoon is kind of the forgotten classic. I think X-Men is the one we all point to as like, oh yeah, that got me into comics, because I think that got a generation of readers into comics. Spider-Man was kind of the other one, you know, almost in the same way that Batman the animated series and like Justice League were the flagship shows, and Superman was just really good, but I don't think it was anyone's like main show. That's how I felt about Spider-Man. It was in many ways as good as X-Men. It never stuck with me the same way that X-Men did.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah. So moving on from Spider-Man, that was a lot of Spider-Man.
It was
for anyone.
But not too much. I mean,
not too much Spider-Man. Just the right amount of Spider-Man.
Easily the best material we covered in that second half. So I don't mind spending the bulk of our time on it. Yeah,
well, I think it deserved it. I mean, that story deserves a proper spotlight and proper attention. And now we can kind of relax and address some of the other comics that came out in 1967. We'll go alphabetically, to be fair.
Okay.
And that means starting with Avengers. One issue of Avengers and one Avengers annual, if I'm not mistaken. The regular issue that introduces Hercules to the team as, you guys nailed it, basically a bargain basement Thor, because Thor's gone and we want a strong mythological character on the team. Not a lot going on in Avengers. Some Black Widow soap opera. In the annual, you get a big oversized adventure with the original characters coming back to interact with Cap's Kiki Quartet. I was thinking about this today, Tim, and I was thinking about Avengers' place in the Silver Age, in 1960s Marvel. And I really do think it was the most awkward fitting of all the Marvel books. And, you know, I've kind of danced around this on other episodes, but I really feel like they had Fantastic Four. That was the flagship. That was the one where they were really doing the stuff they wanted to do. They had Spider-Man, breakout solo character. Then they had all these other kind of like mini successes. You know, your Thors, your Iron Mans, even Captain America when he came back. Those were kind of those, just as we were talking about the tiers of Spider-Man villains earlier, there's no illusion that those characters, as great as they have turned out to be, and as some of their stories were, there were some great Thor stories that we read, they weren't on the level of Spider-Man and Fantastic Four. And when the idea came about, the natural idea that Marvel needed, for better or worse, its Justice League. It needed a book where its solo characters came together. It didn't feel like Justice League in the sense that it was not the top tier. And I'm not talking about just saying like, you know, Hawkeye, Quicksilver, Scarlet Witch are not top tier. I will make the bold statement that in 1963 to 1967, I don't think fans were clamoring to see Thor and Iron Man and Ant-Man or even the Hulk in the same book. I don't think these were Marvel's A-listers. I think these were the leftovers.
Just their cast-offs.
Yeah, I mean, and don't get me wrong, they're fine. They hold up, and obviously history has made stars of these characters, as have many cinematic adaptations. But I think even, let's jump ahead a few decades and look at the 2000s, and Marvel, after going bankrupt, selling off the rights to all their top characters as far as movies. They couldn't make an X-Men movie. They couldn't make a Spider-Man movie. They couldn't make a Fantastic Four movie. Sony and Fox owned the rights to all that. But what did they have left to work with? They had Iron Man. They had Thor. They had Captain America.
Yeah.
And I don't think those were seen as A-list characters until their cinematic interpretations, which were brilliantly done, kind of made them that way. So now, in the modern lens, when you look at Marvel Comics, yes, of course you think of Thor, Cap, and Iron Man, and Hulk as these big, starring spotlight characters. But I think in the 60s, and of course, I wasn't around, so I can't speak to it entirely, but I do feel like this was a B-list title.
I can kind of see that, and in thinking through it myself, you could probably make the case for Thor as more of an A-lister than the others, just because he did come about earlier.
That's true.
Kind of, right on the heels of FF. Has basically his own series, even though technically it is still called Journey into Mystery. But when you look at Iron Man, he's in a flip book with Cap still.
Yeah.
We're talking, what, now some 4 years in? Hasn't been spun off into his own series yet. So you figure, maybe they don't have the confidence to think that this character can support his own book. Maybe that's a limitation of their distribution arrangement. I don't know, but it just seems like if this was truly an A-list character who could, maybe is not going to get you the sales of a Spider-Man or an FF, but is on the level of Thor, then he should have his own book like Thor, right? And he doesn't. It is certainly hard to imagine a world where Ant-Man / Giant Man and the Wasp are perceived as A-listers, so I think you're right on that count. And then you have the Hulk, who we've, of course, talked about, and whose book was a flop. So, yeah, I mean, I could see this group as, even though in story, in universe, they are perceived as like the varsity team, in a way that the FF are not. Like, the FF are the explorers, the adventurers, and the Avengers are like the Marines, basically, And
that's a good way of putting it.
That's the way they're looked at within the context of the stories we're reading. In story. Yeah. But commercially, I mean, maybe that does go back to their roots.
I think it'll be interesting to track as another thing we should keep an eye on as we continue in this experiment, how hard the Avengers get pushed as what you were saying, as the varsity team. Because I think it's a distinction that only gets more pronounced. And we don't have to wait until 2004 for this to happen. It literally, I think by the 70s and certainly by the 80s, there is kind of a rhetoric from Marvel's powers that be that, yes, the Avengers are the A-list team in story that everyone wants to be a part of. I wanted to talk about this because there's not really much else to talk about in these Avengers issues. They're pretty dull. Yeah. So I thought it would be more worth our time to have a larger discussion of kind of the early Avengers and their place in the Marvel Universe. The one other thing I will say is this is the issue drawn by Don Heck, correct?
Yes, he did both issue 38 and that annual, which is actually their first annual. It's called a king size, but it's an annual.
Yeah. And as you guys noted on Marvel Age, the Avengers, years later, getting their first annual after Spider-Man and Fantastic Four had already beaten them to it. And even Thor, to your point of Thor being kind of maybe the biggest star out of this group. You guys didn't praise Don Heck terribly effusively.
I felt bad about that, but I don't know, man. I wasn't
prepare to feel worse, because I'm going to agree with that assessment. I've never been a big Don Heck fan. I think the nicest thing you can say about Don Heck is that he's technically proficient.
Yes.
But I think he lacks the imagination of Kirby, Ditko, Romita, Steranko, even Marie Severin, whose work we've seen throughout 1967. They're just more dynamic, and it felt like Heck was a little bit of a throwback to the golden age of comics, where there was kind of more of a house style and everything was clean. And I think Kirby smashed that style, and anyone who came along in Marvel really had to work hard. We'll see moving forward, the Neil Adams and some of the other young up-and-comers who make their debut. But yeah, Don Heck was never my bag. I don't hate him. It's not.
Oh yeah.
It's not unreadable, and he certainly knows how to tell a competent story. But not one of my favorite Silver Age artists.
Yes, and as a solid hand, I think that Marvel, as a young company, accomplished a lot that probably they wouldn't have been able to without having him as an asset during this time period. So to take nothing away from his contributions and his skills, just compared to some of the other material we've seen so far, doesn't knock my socks off.
Yeah.
And I felt like I was maybe the lowest of our panel on Don Heck's art, but was maybe worth acknowledging.
Yeah, he's a Bobby Eaton type player.
Yes.
In the larger Marvel universe, a solid hand who can be relied upon, but never is breaking through to be a big star. And if all Don Heck gets is to be Bobby Eaton, then you know what? That's not bad.
That's pretty damn good still. Yeah.
Pretty damn good indeed. Let's move on to Daredevil.
Oh,
Daredevil.
God. Okay.
Let's. Oh man, hearing you guys cover Daredevil this time was just a joy. These are, of course, the Mike Murdock issues, and I encourage you guys to go back, if you haven't already, and listen to the latest Marvel Age, where Nick and the crew explain exactly who Mike Murdock is. I'm not going to retread it here, other than just say it's ridiculous. And the Mike dressing as Matt, dressing as Daredevil, dressing as Thor moment.
When did Bob Haney start writing this comic? Because this is...
Boy, this was one of the true lowlights of Marvel's
It's
Silver Age.
absurd. Oh my God. I mean...
So we go ahead.
And I'm not even saying, like, it was hard to read these issues. And I'm not even, like... I guess I am making a quality judgment in a sense, but there is that so bad it's good sense to it. Now, I wanted to get your take, because Todd, our manager, offered the opinion that maybe this was a deliberate riff, that it was trying to be like this.
I like that theory a lot. I don't know that I agree with it, but I like it. Like, I want it to be true. I think with Daredevil's fascinating. Let's do a little diagnosis here, kind of as we did with Avengers. You guys said, I can't remember who said it. It may even have been you, Tim, who noted that there had to be something to Daredevil because it wasn't canceled, like Hulk and X-Men were. So here's the only thing I was thinking, and bear with me for a second, but I think it honestly might have just been the sheer luck of timing.
Yeah.
I think when Hulk came out, Marvel was not successful enough that they were bulletproof. So when something didn't go well, yes, they had to cancel it. Daredevil came a little later, after you already had seen the success of Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Thor, the anthology titles, and they had a little more padding. So Daredevil, I think, had a little bit of protection, because if you look post-Hulk, nothing really gets canceled. No. Like even like Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos is doing fine and runs for years. So it's like nothing's really getting canceled. And by the time the X-Men do go away, they don't even really go away. It just goes to reprints. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think Daredevil was necessarily any better than Hulk or X-Men. I think sales-wise or quality-wise, certainly. I just think it got lucky. I think it just dodged many a bullet. And I think it's just kind of happenstance that Daredevil somehow survived for years. Because as we've said numerous times on this show and on your show, like, Daredevil doesn't get good for another 20 years. And somehow never gets canceled. Like even like you were saying earlier, last time he had a split book. He didn't get his own book. Hulk didn't get his own book. Namor didn't get his own book. Captain America, who actually had good stories, didn't get his own book.
Yeah.
Doctor Strange, Nick Fury. Yet somehow, Daredevil, with his awful supporting cast, with Mike effing MODOK, still hanging in there as a spotlight headlining character. There's got to be a story here somewhere.
I know. That's
we
what
don't know.
That's what I've been searching for. I want to know more the behind the scenes. What was going on with this book? Was it Stan kind of throwing his hands up in the air? Maybe I'm not saying trying to get it canceled, but just what does it take for a book not to sell? Because I'm just over this one and would like to do anything else, but I have to keep doing it because it is selling. I don't know. It just seems to me that the point you made about it being kind of the lucky beneficiary of the momentum in the early years, right? Because it launched in 64.
64, yeah.
And so you had about almost 3 years worth of Marvel having a quality track record going into this new series, and probably some, positive word of mouth, good buzz, such as it was back then, and whatever the circulation figures on related titles, that's sort of what your level was going to be for this. And yeah, maybe it could just coast on that, and that it wasn't selling tremendously better or worse than something like X-Men, but I don't know, maybe it just pulls into the lead that much more in the next 30 issues, because we've got about 30 issues to go before X-Men, as you said, goes into reprints, and is effectively the version of canceled that books were back then.
Yeah.
So I don't know. We'll track that as we go.
I'll say this on just briefly on the matter of Stan Lee's contributions to Daredevil. I was praising Stan for his Spider-Man No More story, and I stand by it. It's brilliant, and some of the work he does on Fantastic Four, Doctor Strange, Thor, even Captain America is really top-level stuff. What's interesting to me is that I think Stan excels at the more melodramatic characters, clearly. Your Silver Surfers, your Thors, your Spider-Mans, where there's really a lot of emotional stuff going on. And I think what we'll learn, not to project too far into the future, is that Daredevil works best when he's a very serious adult character. He does not feel like a young person's character. When the more successful Daredevil runs come, it will be because it's very stern. It's a crime drama.
Yep.
And I don't think that was Stan's specialty. And I think what he did was, when this character didn't work, and this might be me digging into Todd's theory a little bit, is when this character didn't work, his reaction was just to make it more ridiculous and outlandish. Like every time Daredevil wasn't sticking, he's just like, well, I gotta come up with another crazy layer because this book needs drastic actions. I'm really interested to see. I know Daredevil's good in the 80s. I know Frank Miller does a great job. I know early Daredevil by Stan Lee is not very good. I think there is a gap in there, which we'll basically call the 70s, that I have no idea if Daredevil's good or not. When Denny O'Neil's writing it, when Marv Wolfman's writing it, I have never encountered that Daredevil. So I'm really curious to see if, much in the same way you guys have discovered X-Men as almost a hidden gem in the 60s.
Yep.
I want to see if that's Daredevil in the 70s. I don't know how much we get on the reading list, but I'm really interested to see if someone gets Daredevil before Frank Miller gets Daredevil.
I've read bits and pieces of, like, we'll call it Bronze Age 70s Daredevil, and it didn't stand out to me in terms of like being a hidden gem necessarily, but it also doesn't feel like the narrative is, I mean, we've even said as much in the show that Daredevil sucked for 20, 30 years, basically. Yeah. And then, it turned into a good book under Frank Miller. And I think it becomes a readable and decent series, but probably unspectacular. So I am also interested to find out, is there a window where it was like, hey, they're really onto something, and then it gets lost for one reason or another. So we will see. I mean, you figure how bad can something be under
I just
O'Neill,
think,
right?
I just think, and I just think that, again, to reiterate what we already said, there's a story somewhere about why Daredevil ran for 20 to 30 years without being good and never got canceled. Yes. And I implore anyone out there listening who knows any behind-the-scenes stories on, did someone owe someone's kid something to keep this book chugging along well into the 80s without any momentum. Please contact myself or any of the Sarcastic Four and let us know what the hell is going on with Daredevil. We will endeavor to continue trying to get to the bottom of this mystery. But let's move on and get to the bottom of one issue of Tales to Astonish featuring the Hulk and Silver Surfer. Mm-hmm. You guys didn't say a lot about this issue, so I'm not going to say a lot about this issue.
Yeah,
it was drawn by Marie Severin, correct?
It was, yes.
Yeah, and that was good. The art was quality. Here's a question I'll throw at you. This is literally the second book this calendar year, 1967, we're reading in which the Silver Surfer plays a prominent role. Mm-hmm. Was Stan falling in love with this character too quickly, and were they risking burnout with the Surfer? Was he overexposed?
I think that is always a risk. I will say, for my money, I don't find him overexposed yet. And
yeah, me either.
I do get the sense that Stan has fallen in love with this character, but for good reason. There's a lot character. I mean, we've barely scratched the surface of what you can do with a character like that. And if anything, I've wanted to see more. We've really, while he has turned up a lot, I think it's been strategic in the way that he's been utilized. So he does get the big kind of return in that very awesome Fantastic Four story with Doom, which the best material out of that, I think we all unanimously said, was the Doom and Surfer interactions. So
absolutely.
You're like, okay, still firing on all cylinders here. He pops up again in that backup story in the FF annual. Again, not a lead feature, just a backup, so you don't feel like you're ODing on the character. I mean, it's pretty skippable, pretty missable, if, inessential. You're not going to miss anything earth-shattering if you don't read that story. And it's decent enough for what it is. This is the Quasimodo thing, right? So
yeah.
And here, he's taking on the Hulk, but Tales to Astonish being an anthology title, flip book, this is just going to be like an 11-pager,
Yeah.
Not any real risk for burnout for me anyway, just reading these early appearances of the character. It might be too much to ask for him as a protagonist in his own solo series, which maybe stay tuned. But at this point, I think he's well utilized.
Yeah, I think the fun of the Surfer is seeing how he contrasts to other established Marvel characters, be it a Doctor Doom or be it a Hulk. Mm-hmm. He's just such a unique presence and such a unique point of view, being an alien, being someone who's trapped on Earth, and being someone who's kind of discovering humanity for the first time. He's so different from the other Marvel characters that there is value in seeing him get paired up with a Hulk. which I think is a great pairing. Has historically always been a great pairing. Of course, they'll team in Defenders. Silver Surfer memorably shows up in Planet Hulk, and they always have a kind of interesting dynamic in that Surfer is this proud, noble, Shakespearean spouting warrior, and Hulk is just this brute.
Yeah.
So they could not be more different. So playing them up against each other, having them fight, having them interact, it's not the worst idea in the world. So there are other places that I'm not sure I would want to see Surfer as much, but I actually say that Tales to Astonish is not a bad place to land him for his next step on his way to becoming potentially a headliner.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, well, all right, cool, thank you.
It is your show.
So we're good on we're good on Tales to Astonish. Let's talk a little Tales of Suspense, and I have tipped my hat here that I love me some late 60s Captain America. I think it is understated how good Lee and Kirby's Captain America was, and I think it continues here. I love the flashback stories, the Red Skull stuff, the Cosmic Cube, and all of that. But I love here him starting to explore the modern world. I just think it's a great dynamic, that man at a time thing, the kind of paranoia. And we're talking about how it was so hard to be Peter Parker. I love the fact that Steve Rogers, who's straight out of the Golden Age, square-jawed, perfect specimen, but he became, under Stan Lee's pen and Jack Kirby's pencil, a tragic character as well, because he's out of his own time. He's away from his world, and he can never get back those years that he lost. Right. At the one hand, he is this proud symbol of a country, but on the other hand, he's a very human and very lonely figure, struggling to come to terms with the hand fate has dealt him. And I think we start to see that more in these issues as we start getting more of a supporting cast. That we do get Sharon Carter, although I don't believe she's named as such in this. And that I know some who took contention with that. It was probably Nick. Nick gets pissed about everything. I think he was mad because they didn't name Sharon Carter. Well, listen up, Nick. The reason they didn't name her Sharon Carter yet is because they didn't want you to know that she was clearly related to Peggy Carter, who had already been introduced in issues that we didn't read. So they were trying to kind of play that close to the vest. So there.
I don't know if I'll lay that one entirely at Nick's feet.
I'd like to. I want to lay it.
Let's go ahead and do it. Okay.
That's my choice. I'm sure it was probably someone else, but whatever.
It was kind of funny just because I think it echoed to the concept of Stan Lee just not naming these female characters. In this case, there is a legitimate
there's a reason, but honestly, also ironically, I would say that the Carters, Peggy and Sharon, are among the stronger female characters that Stan would introduce at least in the 60s, at least in the Silver Age. I mean, they're certainly leagues above your Sue Storms and your Scarlet Witches. I mean, they're actually characters who have agency and who serve their own purpose in the story and drive their own decisions. And yes, they're in love with Captain America, but that doesn't define them as characters.
Right. Yeah, I would say that Sharon here, unnamed though she may be, is more defined by her mission than she is as, a potential love interest. While they are making googly eyes at each other at some point, that kind of thing goes with the territory. And I'm not trying to make excuses for that type of stuff, but
no.
She, to your point, definitely has more agency, is more driven in terms of having a purpose in this story beyond just, hanging off of the male protagonist's arm.
I think there's a reason that, and we'll talk more about Sharon as she gets fleshed out and gets an official name. But even Peggy at this point, there's a reason that she was one of the first. Think about it, one of the first female success stories in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Headlined her own TV show, tremendously popular cult hit character, obviously portrayed really well by Haley Atwell. But I think some of the early writing on Peggy Carter should also be credited for what a great character she would eventually become in the Captain America movies and beyond. So I do think there's something done there. I think Sharon Carter's great. I think to this day, we talked about Steve Rogers being a man at a time and all the other aspects to him, but he's also this larger than life symbol.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to write a love interest that can stand up to that kind of aura. And I think Sharon Carter, from her introduction, always felt like, okay, this is someone who can stand toe-to-toe with Steve Rogers and his stature and feel worthy. And I think she does to this day.
Yes, very much so. Now, I have to ask, does MODOK hold a special place in your heart?
So MODOK is the favorite Marvel character of my longtime close personal friend and former podcast co-host, Ryan Penagos, a.k.a. H&M.
Okay. I feel a story coming on.
Not much of a story, honestly. It's just that he loved. I wish there was a better story. No, it's just he always loved MODOK. And
okay.
We were always pushing a pro MODOK agenda at Marvel.com. Okay. We wanted to get all the MODOK we could get. What's interesting to me about MODOK, I first encountered MODOK, and I don't know if this is the same for you, Tim, was on the Iron Man cartoon, of all places, where he was just this sniveling, just weird-looking dude. And to me, that's the interpretation of MODOK that stuck for a long time. I think of stories like MODOK's 11, which was kind of his big reintroduction in the late 2000s, and or something like MODOK Assassin during Secret Wars. I think a lot of people have a tendency to play him as a comedy character because he is somewhat ridiculous looking. But as you guys said, when he's introduced in the pages of Tales of Suspense as a Captain America villain, this Kirby visual is if you don't think of him in that context as a humor character, if you don't hear the voice from the Iron Man cartoon, he is terrifying to look at. He is an incredible design. I mean, where did Kirby come up with this? And it's hard. I think I'm struggling to put into words, but I think it's hard to look at these early MODOK appearances without the filter or the context of what he would become and evolve into. But if you strip that away and just picture yourself seeing this visual for the first time, I think you got to be kind of blown away by what Kirby's doing here.
That had to be a shocking reveal on that page turn.
Yeah.
You're just not knowing what to expect. This is a character that's been talked about within the comic you're reading. He's had some, voiceovers, but is unseen. So they're clearly building to something. And you turn that page and it's like, oh my God. So, you sort of have to divorce yourself from the old Marvel action hour. Of the 90s, getting up at, what was it, like 6 or 7 o'clock that thing was on?
That was Iron Man on one side, Fantastic Four on the other side.
Man.
Both terrible cartoons.
Yes.
Just if X-Men and Spider-Man were kind of the apex of the Marvel 90s animated shows, Iron Man in particular was just the pits, and it was based on like the worst era of Iron Man also. The Force Works era.
The Force Works.
So it's like the source material was, and much love to Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning, two of my absolute favorite, not just writers, but people in the comics industry, just two British gentlemen who not only resurrected the Marvel Cosmic line in the 2000s and 2010s, but just stand-up dudes. But to this day, every time I see them, the first thing I do is make fun of them for having written Force Works. And they deserve all the derision that they receive. But,
they'll never live it down.
They'll never live that down. yeah, terrible Iron Man cartoon, terrible portrayal of MODOK. It is very hard to put yourself in the right frame of mind to experience MODOK as Lee and especially Kirby created him. And again, while we're marking down things to keep an eye on as we move forward, maybe one of the things we should keep an eye on is the treatment of MODOK in these early years. Is he seen as a serious threat? Does he become a goofy visual quickly? But I think in these early appearances, I'm just in awe again of Kirby's design sense and just the imagination to come up with something like this.
Yes, we will mark that down for future
MODOK
reference.
Watch. Mm-hmm. Yes.
The MODOK Watch.
The MODOK Watch begins. All right, one last book to cover, Tim, and of course it's appropriate to have you on this episode as you are the X-Men diehard of Place to Be Nation, and we finally got an issue of X-Men after it's been absent for a few years now. Is it the best issue of X-Men?
No.
Jury's a little bit out on that. As you guys covered on Marvel Age, well, number one, it's a Spider-Man guest appearance, and Spider-Man beats the crap out of the X-Men, which would begin a long, sad tradition at Marvel Comics. But more than that, it's in the throes of the Factor 3 storyline. Factor
3, right?
Which to me was probably the nadir of, or the nadir, I don't know how you say it, of 1960s X-Men. All the promise we saw in those early stories with Magneto, with the Sentinels, with the burgeoning civil rights parallels, and all the cool stuff they were doing with X-Men, the personalities, the weirdness, and just the quirkiness, that to me kind of didn't go away entirely, but took a little bit of a break during this storyline. And as I recall, this storyline went on for quite some time.
Yes,
it just dragged. And I think if you want to look at what happened to X-Men and why, as we said when we were talking about Daredevil, that X-Men isn't much longer for this world, I do think that this storyline played a role, just in the fact that I think it killed a lot of the momentum that those early X-Men issues had.
Yeah, it's not a high point of Roy Thomas's writing.
Right.
I will say that he is trying something at least.
Yep.
I mean, there's an originality to this beyond the every other issue we're going to fight Magneto and or the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, which that was the well Stan kept going back to over and over and over, and that wore thin very quickly. He did hit a home run, yes, with that Sentinel story, absolutely, and we heap praise on it deservingly, but beyond that, it was sort of, okay, we need to find a hook, we need to move on to what's the next thing in this series, or how can we move, that metaphor forward. And Thomas coming in, taking over after Lee, doesn't really do that. Goes in a different direction that is very just sort of boilerplate. We're having a mix of different characters. We've got a highly serialized story for this book, but it's just not very inspiring in terms of its concepts, its themes. So yeah, I mean, the middle stretch of this series, I would agree, is rather dour, and maybe once it gets the shot in the arm that it does, that comes a bit too little too late.
Yeah. I mean, that's what you're alluding to, is there's going to be a creative change that really invigorates the X-Men, and I think inspires Thomas to do some of his best early work. I think you nailed it with your analysis. Basically, X-Men lost what made it stand out from Fantastic Four and Avengers, and that was just kind of the fact that it was this weird, outside the lines book. It was a little more socially aware than its contemporaries. And I think when Roy Thomas took it over, no disrespect to Roy Thomas, he really made it into just another superhero book. And we already had enough straight superhero books at Marvel. We wanted something different with this. Just the idea that he's like, oh, it's, you know, it's all their old enemies teaming together in this mysterious threat is, you nailed it when you said boilerplate. That's kind of what this feels like. So, when does we'll stay kind of mysterious and teasy, but what year does X-Men get the aforementioned shot in the arm? Is it 68 or do we have to wait a little longer?
Well, it's going to be coming up in 68. I'm looking at how much of that we're actually going to be covering. Am I wrong? I think the run we're referring to does start in 68, but I think our coverage is not going to be until 69, really.
All right, well, I look forward to that.
We got to wait a year for the Marvel Age treatment of some pretty solid and influential X-Men work coming up. Yeah,
some of the, again, breaking the myth of X-Men was never good until Chris Claremont came along. That we already kind of shattered that with the Sentinel story, but I think it will get further disproven when we get into that good stuff.
And I'm not talking about the costume change.
Yeah, all right. If everyone's hanging around thinking we're just talking about they get their own costumes, no. There's more to it than just that.
Yeah, that is coming, but we've still got the potato sack, as I like to call them, uniforms here.
Yeah, and with that, we conclude our journey through 1967. Tim, any final thoughts on the year that was? Stuff we talked about this episode, stuff we talked about last episode. I had a lot of fun sitting here talking comics with you.
Yeah, had a lot of fun, as I always do, talking these comics and learning something at the same time. As for this installment, looking at 67 as a whole, kind of a mixed bag. I think the clear standouts were FF and Spider-Man, but that's kind of as it should be in 60s Marvel, I feel like. You know, these are their most popular, biggest, most visible characters, so let's give them the best stories. I kind of can't argue against that. So we will see things start to heat up a bit going into 68, but I think the 60s have really belonged to FF and Spider-Man to a lesser extent, although that is debatable. I mean, I think you talk to our panel, Spidey and FF could be neck and neck.
Yeah, there's no question that these were Stan's favorites. FF and Spider-Man were his favorite kids, and FF is where Kirby really put a lot of his effort. There are always great artists on Spider-Man. What's going to be interesting as we move into the 70s and even a bit in the late 60s is as these new voices emerge, how are other creators going to step up and make these characters who were not Lee's favorites, who were kind of his cast-offs? We already started to see it a little bit in 67 with Jim Steranko on Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. Who's going to craft the classics of these characters? Who's going to put their own stamp and say, you know, my take on Iron Man is as good as Stan's take on Spider-Man? And is it actually as good? That's debatable. But I do think we are going to get to see some people take a shot, and that's pretty exciting.
Stay tuned.
Sure do. So, Tim, what else is going on around these internets and social media areas for you?
Okay, social media. You can find me on Twitter, sporadically anyway, at Psych68, that's CYKE68. I have been enjoying vicariously your various WCW rewatches and tweets.
I thought you'd enjoy that. Yeah, if anyone would appreciate it, it would be it's you and Greg.
Yeah, so if nothing else, you'll find me retweeting and replying to Ben, I guess. Speaking of WCW, on the Place to Be Nation wrestling feed, so sister feed to Place to Be Nation, I co-host the Survey Says podcast, a WCW retrospective with Andy Helene. We just dropped our September episode, late September, really going into October, which was a look back on the career of Diamond Dallas Page.
Oh man, a favorite.
Yeah,
someone I'm actually really coming to appreciate more as I'm doing my rewatch and getting into '97. I always knew he was a great character, but I'm really gaining a new appreciation for the in-ring aspect of how well he worked, not just on pay-per-views, but on the nitros and stuff as well.
Dude was a workhorse.
Yeah.
And as much as he was dogged back then for like plotting out and rehearsing spots or whatever, it's proven to be really ahead of its time, because that's what everybody does now. Yeah,
that's what everyone does now. And there's something to be said for the result as well. The stuff with him and Savage is just next level.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah. So that is actually kind of our lightly celebrating our second anniversary of Survey Says. So
congratulations.
Do it with a big one. Thank you. And very proud of that episode. Check it out on Place to Be Nation Wrestling. Also on Place to Be Nation Pop, you can find Talkin' Pop, myself and Jennifer Smith. We will be recording our next episode of that program.
You keep threatening that.
I keep threatening that, but we have actually plotted it out. I'm not going to tell you exactly what it is, but I'll tell you we have thrown the format out the window, and we're going to be doing a live watch.
Oh, nice.
It's going to be a somewhat seasonal appropriate live watch, but I don't think anyone's going to be able to guess what it is. So look for that. I mean, probably within a couple days of this show you're listening to right now.
Yeah, there you go.
How about it?
Cool.
And, of course, the Marvel Age podcast, which this is the reaction to. So our next episode of Marvel Age proper going to be covering the first part of 1968. That's not going to be until later in October, just for football barf reasons. So it is what it is. We're not behind or anything. It's just that's the schedule we're at the mercy to. So that'll be coming up later this month in October.
Totally fair. As for myself, on social media, you can follow me at Ben J. Morse on Twitter, at Ben Morse 882 on Instagram. Also follow PTBN Comics on Twitter, and visit the Place to Be Nation Comics Facebook page as well. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that all of you can head to your local comic shops, and this is an odd thing to say on our Marvel podcast, but pick up the new DC Nation. I think it's issue number 5. It's free. I got to talk to old buddy of mine, Peter Tomasi, about taking over Detective Comics and his plans for his return to Batman. So I'm pretty proud of that, and I hope people do check it out. And with that said, that's all I've got to say, Tim.
That's all I've got to say, Ben.
All right, man. Then until next time, class dismissed.
Promotional consideration paid for by the following.
Place to Be Nation's Justin Rosero and Chad Campbell here, and we want to let you know that we have a ton of great podcasts available to you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and PlaceToBeNation.com, and we now offer them to you on 2 great feeds. On the Place to Be Nation Wrestling feed, we bring you the Mothership, the Place to Be podcast, Main Event, Survey Says, Wrestling Warzone, a Monday Night Wars podcast retrospective, No Holds Barred, Jeff Learns Wrestling, and our monthly pay-per-view reaction shows. On top of that, we're also dipping into the vault, re-releasing the entire catalog of where the big boys play for your enjoyment. In addition to these full-length shows, we also deliver special network pod blasts on topics old and new.
The Place to Be Nation pops! feed is loaded with great content, offering such tremendous shows covering the land of pop culture, such as Geekin' Sassy, Talkin' Pop, the Glenn Butler Podcast Hour Spectacular, Sunday Groove, PTBN Play, Freak Out Drive-In, Songs with Friends, Looking Forward, Looking Back, and Lucha Undead, as well as a veritable podcast heaven for comics fans with the hard-traveling fanboys, Sellers Points, Conversation Comics, DC Post-Crisis Management, Marvel Age, and Marvel Age Masterclass, plus weekly pod blasts that cover the gamut of comic topics. The feed is also filled with insightful sports content, including the NBA team, This Week in the NFL, and more.
And you can find all these current shows, plus archives of our past podcasts, including The Kevin Kelly Show, as well by subscribing to both feeds on iTunes. And while there, be sure to rate and leave feedback as well. All of these shows, plus others, available at PlayStation.com. We cover pro wrestling, sports, movies, comics, in-depth stretch projects, and more. Be sure to support our site by using PlayStation.com/Amazon while doing your online shopping. And download our free PTB Vintage Vault Refresh ebooks via the links on our site. We also want to thank our friends at Boneheads Wing Bar, ProWrestlingOnly.com, and TheHistoryOfWrestling.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr as well. PlayStation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.